The camera caught it in a flash. The thud of Steve Bannon's hand against the desk reverberated through the studio like a war drum. His face, flushed and rigid with fury, leaned toward the microphone as he barked over his own words, desperate to regain control of the airwaves. His voice wasn't reasoned. It was rage, sharpened by years of swagger and entitlement. But across from him, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice, didn't match his theatrics. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, eyes steady, lips curling into a knowing half-smile. And when she finally spoke, her words cut sharper than any shout could. Steve, the louder you scream, the more obvious it becomes. You're not fighting for truth. You're just terrified of it. The room froze. For a heartbeat, even the producers behind the glass seemed to hold their breath. The silence wasn't empty, it was electric. The kind of silence that only arrives when arrogance collides with unshakable calm. Bannon's bluster cracked in real time, and the audience watching could feel the power shift. Because this wasn't just political theater. It wasn't just another cable segment. What unfolded live on air wasn't simply a clash of personalities, was a battle for truth, for dignity, for America's soul. And Crockett, with her steady poise, became the embodiment of something bigger than herself. The refusal to be bulldozed, the insistence that integrity can stare down intimidation and win. And in that charged moment, when Steve Bannon lost his composure and Jasmine Crockett exposed him with nothing but clarity and courage, the nation didn't just watch, they felt it. But what came next would ignite a firestorm far beyond the studio walls. To understand the weight of that moment, you have to know who Steve Bannon is. For years, he styled himself as the master strategist, the brain behind Trump's rise, the architect of an entire movement built on fury and fear. His War Room podcast became his pulpit, a place where volume substituted for truth, and where dominance was measured not by facts, but by how thoroughly he could bulldoze his guests. He wasn't just a political figure, he was a performer, a man who thrived on chaos, convinced that if he shouted loudly enough, history would bend to his will. Across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, a very different kind of force, a lawyer by training, a congresswoman from Texas by conviction, and a woman who built her career on confronting injustice head-on. She was not polished for the sake of appeasement, nor willing to shrink herself to fit a mold. Crockett came into the public eye as someone unwilling to compromise her voice. Whether it was calling out hypocrisy in the halls of power or standing firm for those left unheard. She didn't mistake kindness for weakness, and she didn't mistake bluster for strength. And that's what made this clash so riveting. Because the media battlefield isn't harmless entertainment. It shapes how Americans see each other, how they define truth, how they decide who deserves to lead. When someone like Bannon dominates airwaves unchecked, it isn't just noise, poison. And when someone like Crockett stands her ground, it isn't just resistance, it's remedy. But what Bannon didn't expect was Crockett's preparation, her calm clarity, and her refusal to be bullied. He came armed with volume. She came armed with truth. And as their words collided on live broadcast, the audience could sense something was about to break. Before his face turned crimson in that studio, before his hand slammed against the desk, Steve Bannon had already cultivated a reputation as one of America's most notorious political villains. He wasn't just a strategist. He was a manipulator, a provocateur who thrived on keeping his opponents off balance and his followers whipped into a frenzy. For years, Bannon sold himself as the voice of the forgotten American, the champion of the working class. But peel back the layers, and a different picture emerges, one marked by scandal, contradiction, and a hunger for power at any cost. Bannon's notoriety first skyrocketed during his time as Trump's chief strategist. He painted himself as the architect of an insurgent movement, a cultural warrior battling against the so-called elites. Yet behind the curtain, his connections were as elite as they come Wall Street ties, Hollywood stints, international dealings that revealed him not as a man of the people, but as a man skilled in packaging chaos for personal gain. He preached nationalism while benefiting from global networks. He claimed to fight corruption while courting it in plain sight. His fingerprints were all over Cambridge Analytica, the shadowy firm accused of manipulating Facebook data to tilt elections. The controversy exposed just how far Bannon was willing to go to control narratives, turning personal information into political ammunition. And then came the Build the Wall fiasco, a crowdfunding scheme that ended in fraud charges. While everyday Americans donated their hard-earned dollars believing they were funding border security, prosecutors alleged Bannon and his associates siphoned funds for personal luxuries. For a man who claimed to stand shoulder to shoulder with the working class, it was a betrayal that echoed loudly. And yet, through it all, Bannon never quieted down. If anything, his rhetoric grew louder, more incendiary. He relished provocation, calling for political enemies to be taken out, painting journalists as traitors, framing immigrants as invaders. He thrived on the sound of his own fury, convinced that chaos was power. To him, volume equaled victory. But here's the contradiction. The man who styled himself as a populist rebel was also a man living in the grip of the very elite games he claimed to oppose. He mocked the establishment even as he fed off its wealth. He cast himself as the outsider, yet his fingerprints were all over insider deals. It was this duplicity, this double life, that made him both dangerous and vulnerable. Because no matter how loudly a man shouts, truth has a way of breaking through. And on that day in the studio, the master of noise was about to face someone who didn't need to shout to be heard. The man who thrived in chaos was about to meet a storm he couldn't control. Asterisk long before her words cut through Steve Bannon's fury. Jasmine Crockett had already carved a reputation as one of the fiercest voices in American politics. Born and raised in St. Louis, she grew up watching firsthand the way injustice threads itself through everyday life. For her, inequality wasn't an abstract idea debated on panels, it was something she saw in her neighborhood, in her schools, and in the lives of the people around her. It was that reality, not ambition alone, that pushed her toward the law. As a young attorney in Texas, Crockett didn't chase corporate clients or easy paychecks. She threw herself into civil rights cases, defending people who had no one else to stand with them, when activists filled the streets demanding racial justice. She wasn't just marching, she was working behind the scenes, making sure protesters had legal protection when the system turned against them. Every brief she wrote, every argument she made in court, carried the weight of someone else's struggle for dignity. That work hardened her resolve, but also sharpened her wit. Crockett became known for being unapologetically bold, quick on her feet, and unwilling to be silenced. Yet her boldness wasn't reckless. It was anchored in the discipline of the law. She could recite statutes as easily as she could throw a devastating one-liner. In a political landscape often filled with noise, her power came from clarity, and clarity mattered, because Crockett understood barriers more intimately than most. As a black woman in the South, she faced the double weight of racism and sexism. the constant pressure to prove herself in spaces designed to keep her out. But rather than shrinking under that weight, she transformed it into fuel. Her very presence became defiance, a declaration that she wouldn't just sit at the table, she would speak at it, reshape it, and if necessary, flip it. That's what made her such a contrast to Steve Bannon. He was chaos incarnate, a man who mistook aggression for strength. She was calm, precision, a woman who wielded truth like a scalpel. He spun narratives designed to confuse. She cut through spin with facts that landed like hammers. Where he thrived on volume, she thrived on composure. So when these two worlds collided, live on air, the loud provocateur who built his career on shouting, and the unflinching congresswoman who built hers on justice, the outcome wasn't just predictable, it was inevitable. The confrontation didn't explode. All at once, Sid simmered, tension rising with every passing second. Steve Bannon leaned forward, cutting her off mid-sentence, his words spilling over hers in a torrent of interruptions. It was his trademark. Move, dominate the sound, drown out the opposition, and hope the noise alone would crown him victor. His voice carried the familiar cadence of anger, an almost desperate urgency, as if sheer volume could replace logic. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Each time Bannon tried to bulldoze her, she paused, allowed his thunder to roll, and then stepped back in with razor-sharp precision. Her sentences were clipped, factual, piercing. She didn't need to match his fire with fire. She simply poured water, extinguishing his blaze before it could catch. Every time Bannon raised his voice, Crockett sharpened her silence into a blade. And when she spoke, it was that silence that made her words land harder than his shouts ever could. The audience, watching in real time, could feel the imbalance. Social media lit up like a switchboard. Tweets popped up instantly. Crockett is cutting him to pieces without even raising her voice. GIFs of her calm stare circulated, side by side, with images of Bannon's reddening face. In the studio itself, subtle reactions told the story producers smirking behind glass. A few suppressed laughs from the staff as Crockett's composure turned Bannon's fury into spectacle. Still, Bannon pushed harder, his interruptions multiplying. He accused, deflected, shifted topics with wild swings, hoping to trip her up. Yet every accusation found its answer. Every deflection met a direct hit. Crockett anchored herself in Fax's past scandals, his hypocrisy, his contradictions, and each one landed with surgical impact. The tension reached a breaking point. The louder he grew, the smaller he looked. The calmer she remained, the larger she loomed. The dynamic flipped before the audience's eyes. No longer the feared strategist, Bannon seemed cornered, while Crockett radiated control. And then came the counterpunch that shattered Bannon's composure. Asterisk, the storm had been building for minutes. Bannon's fury on one side, Crockett's calm precision on the other. And then, with the kind of timing that only comes from preparation, Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, folded her hands, and let the silence linger. That pause wasn't hesitation, it was theater. The audience watching could feel it quiet before the strike. When she spoke, her voice was steady, deliberate. Steve, you've built a career pretending to fight for the working class. But let's be honest, you've never walked their walk. You've exploited their anger. You've profited from their pain. The words landed like hammer blows. Bannon tried to interject, his voice cracking with impatience. But Crockett didn't stop. She pulled out receipts, his ties to Cambridge, Analytica, the manipulation of voters' data, The build-the-wall fraud scandal, where donations meant for security ended up funding luxury instead. Each fact was laid down like evidence before a jury, and the nation was watching as she built her case. Bannon fumbled, flipping through his notes, muttering about fake news and political witch hunts. His once commanding tone sounded brittle, defensive. Every deflection rang hollow. Every attempted pivot was dragged back into the light by Crockett's persistence. She let him squirm, then delivered the line that broke through his bluster. "You call yourself a fighter for America, but you've never stood with the people, you've stood over them, using their trust as currency. And that's why you're terrified of this conversation. Because the truth doesn't need to shout, Steve. It only needs to be heard." For a moment, silence. The camera caught Bannon's jaw tighten, his eyes flickering as if searching for an escape route. He wasn't used to this being dismantled. Not by louder voices, but by sharper truths. And then the eruption came not from Bannon, but from the audience outside the studio. Social media lit up like fireworks. Tweets flooded timelines. Crockett just ended Bannon live on air. Clips of her calm delivery spread faster than his angry outbursts. Memes appeared within minutes, side-by-side screenshots of his crimson face and her composed stare. The hashtag was born instantly. Hashtag Crockett exposes Bannon. Even commentators watching in real time couldn't help but react. One post read, "This isn't a debate, it's a dismantling." Another declared, "Crockett just taught a man in how to deal with bullies." The more the reactions poured in, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a political exchange. It was a cultural moment. People who had felt silenced, steamrolled, or ignored saw in Crockett's calm defiance a reflection of themselves. She didn't just argue with Bannon. She unmasked him, showing the nation the man behind the noise. And Bannon knew it. His gestures grew erratic, his interruptions less coherent. The once orchestrated persona of the master manipulator looked ragged, exposed. Crockett hadn't raised her voice once, but she had done something far more powerful. She had stripped him of the myth he'd built around himself. It wasn't just a takedown. It was a public UNMA's KING. Asterisk, the moment the segment ended, the internet caught fire. Within minutes, the clip of JasmineCrockett's.com takedown was circulating across every platform, reshared with captions that turned into rallying cries. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram Mitcha feed became a mirror reflecting the same truth. Something unforgettable had just unfolded live on air. Memes appeared in real time. One side-by-side image showed Bannon's crimson face against Crockett's poised smile, with the caption, "Volume versus Vision." Another mocked his interruptions by looping his sputtering into a comic beat, contrasted with her stillness that needed no soundtrack. The hashtag Crockett exposes Bannon trended within an hour, pulling in millions of views. Mainstream outlets quickly followed. CNN called it a moment of clarity in a sea of noise. MSNBC anchors replayed the clip, one commentator declaring, "This wasn't just a win, this was obliteration." Conservative hosts scrambled to defend Bannon, framing him as passionate or claiming the segment was unfairly moderated. But their words rang hollow in the echo chamber of a digital audience that had already decided what they had seen. Ordinary viewers lent their voices to the chorus. A viral post read, "She didn't just win, she obliterated him, with grace, with facts, with composure." Another, from a young woman of color, declared, "Watching Crockett today made me believe I can take up space in any room, no matter how loud they try to silence me." The ripple effect was immediate and profound. College students began sharing the clip in group chats. Activists held it up as a case study in dismantling arrogance. For many, it wasn't just Crockett versus Bannon, it was themselves versus every voice that had ever tried to drown them out. Crockett had shown that dignity could not only survive chaos, but outshine it. Even late-night comedians joined in, turning Bannon's fumbling into punchlines, while praising Crockett's unflappable cool. What began as a political clash had morphed into a cultural phenomenon, a shared story retold in countless voices, each one adding fuel to the fire. Asterisk, as the echoes of that broadcast rippled outward. Jasmine Crockett refused to let the narrative remain a personal duel. She spoke later with clarity that cut deeper than any single exchange could. This isn't about me versus Steve Bannon. It's about truth versus lies, dignity versus hate, service versus self-interest. Her words reframed the spectacle, reminding the nation that the battle wasn't confined to a studio, it was a mirror held up to America itself. In the weeks that followed, commentators dissected not just the viral moment, but the values it revealed. Crockett had modeled something rare, the ability to face arrogance without adopting its posture, to confront venom without letting it poison her tone. For those watching, especially young immigrants, women of color, and those who had long felt sidelined, her stance became a living argument for courage. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. On one side, noise, bluster, self-promotion wrapped in anger. On the other, calm evidence, grounded conviction, a reminder that public service means accountability. America saw, in real time, the difference between power wielded for ego and leadership. Rooted in principle, the lesson transcended politics. Teachers showed the clip to students, learning about rhetoric and civic duty. Parents replayed it at dinner tables as an example of grace under fire. Activists invoked it as proof that silence can be sharpened into resistance, that preparation can outlast provocation. And as the hashtags cooled and the memes gave way to reflection, one truth lingered. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it listens. Sometimes it simply refuses to bend. And in that stillness, it shines brighter than any outburst. Crockett's moment was more than a mic drop. It was a reminder of what America could be when integrity stands tall. Diversity not as a talking point, but as lived reality. Justice not as a slogan, but as practice. Empathy not as weakness, but as strength. Millions carried away the memory of her steady voice, cutting through chaos. Not because it humiliated a rival, but because it dignified the conversation. And in that moment, the nation remembered, dignity doesn't shout, it shines. Asterisk. Steve Bannon lost it. Jasmine Crockett exposed, live, unfiltered, undeniable. The title of this story wasn't clickbait. It was exactly what unfolded before millions of eyes. The fall of bluster against the rise of truth. But what made this moment unforgettable wasn't just the clash of personalities, was the clarity it left behind. Crockett reminded us that facts don't need fury, that dignity doesn't need to shout. In a media landscape drowning in noise, she proved that calm conviction can cut sharper than rage. This is where the story belongs to more than just Crockett or Bannon. It belongs to all of us, because every time lies dominate unchecked, democracy weakens, and every time truth stands tall, it breathes new life into what this country is meant to be. If you believe truth deserves a louder voice than lies, join this channel, share this story. Be part of a movement that refuses to let chaos drown out clarity. Let's make sure voices like Jasmine's echo far beyond one broadcast into classrooms, communities, and conversations that will shape the future.